I'm very, very excited. So please help me welcome Rico.
Thanks, Justin. Appreciate it. Thanks, everybody, for bringing me all the way out here from Tennessee. My name is Rico Walder. I've been around for quite a while, breeding green tree pythons as well as working in the zoo and aquarium industry. I spent about 20 years working for AZA accredited zoos and aquariums within the U.S. PowerPoint figured out here.
Yeah, figure out.
Okay, you got the little...
Yes, we got it.
Okay, here's a little synopsis of me. I was born a long time ago. I was really young. Don't remember how old I was when I was born, but I kind of became a private hobbyist in about 1979, and I had a bunch of various professional friends who worked in zoos and aquariums who had kind of got me interested in it. Also was influenced greatly by some elementary school teachers that I had that had a lot of herps in the classroom. Plus I was out catching things a lot as a young child, getting dirty and bringing things home to mom and not being terribly pleased with me some days, but oh well. I also worked in the retail and wholesale pet industry, was in the zoo and aquarium industry for, like I said, about 20 years. In 1996, I started Signal Herp as an actual business. And up until then, it was pretty much just a hobby. Kind of filled a lot of my spare time, a lot of my interest. But I really started focusing on green tree pythons and emerald tree boas, all the arboreal species that I really liked over the years, back in the early 90s. And about 96 is when it sort of blossomed to the point to where this really needs to become something more serious, because I'm doing more than just a hobby here. So, and in 2007, I became a full-time snake breeder. I left my career, probably a foolish move, but now I proudly say I'm an unemployed flesh peddler. So. Okay, what we're going to do is talk about green tree pythons. Can we dim the lights a little bit in here? Is that possible? Or is it all or
It's so
nothing?
much prettier. It can be done.
Yeah, the pictures stand out so much better. No.
Press it in the middle one.
Justin's trying to work his magic. Perfect. Excellent. Okay, yeah, no, this should be good. I think everybody can still see to get around. So basically this is what we all know as a green tree python. We've got some different examples up front here. You guys, after the meeting, if you want to come up and take a peek at everything and ask questions, I'm more than happy to answer. Next slide. Okay, this should be a really short, fast presentation, and then we can get on to the more important stuff. All you really need are 2 adults, preferably the opposite sex. 1 cage at least. You put them together, they breed, female lays eggs, the eggs hatch, babies eat, you're done, let's go home.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. We all wish it was that easy. Give you a little history on kind of green tree pythons. They've been one of the more challenging species over the years. They're a little bit more delicate. As our junior herpers pointed out this evening, they're a rainforest tropical species. They're found in fairly limited habitat types over a fairly broad range of the island of New Guinea, some of the surrounding islands, as well as the northern tip of Australia. Captive history. The first captive breeding was actually done in Switzerland by Henry Kratzer in early 1960s, 1961. The first U.S. captive hatch was by Carl Switek at the Steinhardt Aquarium. He was a well-known reptile curator out there who went to New Guinea on various collecting expeditions, managed to bring back a few green tree pythons. One of them actually happened to be gravid at the time, laid eggs in the bag on the flight back from New Guinea, and believe it or not, the eggs hatched, and that's where some of the first captive U.S. green tree pythons came from. Now, the first actual breeding took place at Sedgwick County Zoo in 1976. They did it with a couple of wild-caught animals. There is some speculation as to whether or not they really got a gravid animal in or not, because they were never able to reproduce that success for many years. And then the first private breeding was done by Trooper Walsh keeper at the National Zoo in Washington, D.C., who had basically a basement full of tree worms, as he called them. And he was pretty successful between Trooper's private collection and the collection at the National Zoo. That's where a lot of the original founding bloodlines came from. And if you trace back a lot of the really sort of higher end designer animals now, like the high blues, the high blacks, some of the real high yellow animals, you'll trace them back to some of these first captive breedings in the U.S. Everybody hates record keeping, I know, and so I kind of threw this slide up to kind of be a little bit humorous, but it is actually a fairly important thing to try to keep up with. And you can keep records for a number of reasons, or you can not keep records. It's just up to the individual, but you'll have a whole lot more success and be able to reproduce what happens if you keep fairly good records on your animals and on the conditions that you keep them in, where, you know, what you put them through in order to reproduce them. So kind of why keep records? You want a history of the animal. You know, a lot of people just do a very simplified like data card where they record feeds and sheds and that kind of stuff, where the animal came from, species, you know, maybe the dam and sire, mom and dad, and maybe they want a little information on that. Or you can get a little bit more involved, like one of my pedigrees over here. You can see basically traces a lot of the animals back to the founders. And it's a good way to kind of know where your animals came from, and especially with digital photography nowadays, it's really easy to keep track of what different parent stock look like. So if you're trying to breed for a specific color, it's nice to have a pedigree to go back to and say, okay, this line has been selectively bred for this trait or for that trait. So that does kind of help. Another thing is health monitoring. If you've got an animal that's got a history of problems, green tree pythons are notorious for prolapses, basically where the intestinal tissue is expelled out the vent. I'm sure that's got to be painful for the animal, but you can also kind of keep track of who's doing it, what's happened, what happened prior to them. Do they do it after a particularly big meal? Do they do it for whatever reason? But again, record keeping is good. So you can monitor growth. This is a little weight chart that I can print out on my database. I'm kind of a records geek. I keep it all on computer, so I'll go into that a little bit more. But the next one, you can keep reproduction. Like here, basically, this is just a little report I did on one of my females. Shows all the different clutches that she'd laid, different egg sizes. I can compare and contrast. Go back, look at the different dates when she laid. Kind of how consistent they are. Basically like June. Once a female starts to go, usually you'll see them go in that same sort of pattern every year. So, like I said, I'm kind of a database or records geek. This is the database program I use. I've got a link to it on the homepage of my website if anybody's really interested. But it's really functional. It's pretty easy to use and can give you a lot of information back. But you can put pictures of the animals in there and keep a whole lot of information on there. And you can see what's set up to where different activities are color coded. And like green is an egg laying. And then you can pull up like a female's clutch. If you do that, then it'll show up with all the offspring that are there, and you can click on those, and it'll take you right to the offspring. Like I said, I'm a record-keeping geek, so I do use a barcode scanner, and every animal is basically assigned an ID number, like this here. Basically, the first 2 digits would be the year code, and the next 3 would be the sequence of acquisition for the year. The numbers below that are usually dam and sire, or mom and dad, and then genus and species, a morph if there's a morph to it, and then all my activities all have barcodes as well, like all my different prey items, mice, soft furs, rat fuzzies, pinkies, all that stuff. So if I go through on a night and I feed 200 green tree pythons, it takes me maybe 10 minutes to record all that data. So all I have to do is go scan the animal's cage with the barcode, scan whatever prey item it had. At the end of that scanning session, suck it all into the database, and it's done. So it's just, for a large collection, it's really a useful thing. If you've got a few animals, it's probably not as big of a deal. So, all right, since this was so easy, go on to basically starting out. You're going to need some healthy adults, and now we've got the luxury that green tree pythons have been captive bred for many decades now. So it's not too hard to go find yourself a good quality captive bred animal. If you wind up going the cheap farm bred import route, you can be successful there as well. Hopefully you have a good veterinarian that you trust and that you can work with, because most of those animals are pretty heavily parasitized. And honestly, some of the field work that I've seen on green tree pythons throughout Indonesia pretty much shows that most of these farm bred animals are actually wild caught, laundered animals coming through the trade. So you just have to be prepared to know what you're dealing with and be able to clean the animals up. As far as size goes, males, a good general rule is about 300 grams or about 3 years of age. Females, I like them to be about 750 to 800 grams and about 4 years of age. One thing that you'll see mature males do, sometimes you'll find shed sperm plugs of the hemipines in the water bowls or in the cages somewhere. The wild-caught founders obviously have parasites and other more significant problems at times. So now what we wind up doing, we run our facility through kind of an annual temperature cycle. Here's pretty much ambient daily highs in the summer, usually May to October, about 84 to 88 degrees on average within the room. The animals always have a little bit of a basking area for at least a few hours a day. In the wintertime, we might drop those high temperatures down a few degrees, maybe to 81, 84, 80 degrees right in there. And then for daily lows, we do a night drop on everything, all the animals year round. Basically, the way I look at it is everywhere that reptiles are found, the sun goes up and the sun comes down. So animals have the opportunity to heat up and to cool off. And reptiles' bodies need rest just like people do. So it's kind of like you staying awake the whole time and your body being constantly in motion. You're going to get worn out and your immune system is going to start to go down. So I see much better health of the animals if you can run them through a daily temperature cycle. So in the summertime, nighttime lows might be in the high 70s to low 80s. In the wintertime, when we're cycling animals, we'll take it down to about 70, 72, maybe 74 right in there. So. And a lot of people think because these are rainforest species, they've got to be really wet all the time. Not necessarily the case. These guys are sitting up in the trees. There's some air movement going on. They're not in a completely sopping wet environment all the time. So you're better off looking at a humidity range of 40 to 70% is where I like to be. A little bit higher maybe during a shed cycle if the animals are getting ready to shed. Make sure that they're well hydrated, raise the humidity a little bit more. And you'll get good sheds out of them. So, like I said, I'm a records geek. So, I've got some little devices throughout my snake room that are called data loggers. They're actually temperature monitoring units. I can hook them up to my computer, and I basically tell the logger to take the temperature once an hour, 365 days a year. And then I get these crazy kind of graphs coming along. So, you can more or less see, sort of a little bit of a peaks and valleys. It's not huge, but there is definitely a defined difference throughout the seasons. And this is just kind of a close-up. Fortunately, this was one I did in Celsius, but you can see there's fairly decent variation in daily temperatures. Put a lot of those slides in this. And here's humidity. Again, basically you're looking between 40 and 70 for the most part. Rarely will it get much higher than that. And these are not in the cages, but my ambient room temperature, because we do have a dedicated facility, about 1,400 square feet, with its own heating and air that's completely separate from the house. So, we can run that without affecting people's lives. And feeding, we do tend to feed, probably a lot more sparingly than what a lot of other people do. Males, actually this is kind of almost even an overestimate. 18 to 20 meals a year is probably on the high end. A lot of times males will get fed once every 3, maybe 4 weeks. Even an adult male may only get an adult mouse and one prey item at a time. So these guys are staying pretty lean throughout the year. Basically, if you get males a little bit too heavy, and especially for arboreal species that are somewhat active at night, they don't make great breeders. You know, green tree pythons live in the trees. They need to be slender. They need to be lightweight. They're not supposed to be round. They're not blood pythons. There's a reason bloods don't live in trees. So we do tend to feed fairly sparingly. Some males will fast for just a few weeks during the breeding season. I've had some males that I'd swore were ball pythons because they didn't feed for 9 or 10 months out of the year. But when they did eat, man, they'd want to eat every day. And females try to run about 30 to 40 meals per year. They usually will go off food when they're gravid or when they're pregnant. Most of my adult prey items are about 25 to 30 grams, and figuring an adult female green tree python 700 to probably 1,200, 1,500 grams. That's not much food for these animals, but they're very efficient at metabolizing all of that prey item. So you really don't need to pound these guys full of food. If they're on the lean side, they'll actually make much better breeders. So I may even use small soft furs occasionally. So. And everybody always asks, you know, why do I feed mice? Because there's a book that came out a few years ago. Greg Maxwell wrote a great little book, The Complete Chondro, and it's a pretty good guide. I don't agree with everything in it, but then I don't agree with everything in every book anyway. So, but Greg advocated the feeding of small rats, and to me, a small rat of an equivalent size that a green tree python can eat it is still going to be an animal that's very high in mother's milk fat. It's not going to have a completely developed skeleton. Unlike an adult mouse of a similar size, you're going to get a much higher calcium content out of that. And so you also have a much smaller fecal matter, you know, defecation to have to pass. And so with green tree pythons and their prolapsing issues, smaller fecals are better for more consistent and easier passing of that without the problems of the prolapses. So this is a nutrition chart I stole from Doug Mader's book years ago. You know, unfortunately, it doesn't compare like small rat and pinks and pups and that kind of stuff. But if you look at sort of the calcium content of an adult mouse versus fuzzies and pinkies, you can see there's a pretty good size difference. And we sort of extrapolate out that rats probably have the same kind of deficiency. So, you know, overall, basically just mice have worked out a lot better for us. We've actually seen better quality eggs out of the animals since we've switched to an entirely mouse diet for the green trees. Another important factor is proper housing. This is a picture of part of our facility. You know, back in the day, before all these, you know, commercial cages were out there, we'd make our own glass cages. Just use very simple setups with basking lights, and like I said, the whole room is heated and cooled throughout the year. The juveniles and the babies are in the racks around the side. And not all green tree pythons like to live in the trees. This is my competition for the ball python breeders out there. If you have snakes that you like to see hiding under the paper, contact me, I'll let you get in on this one. These are some of our newer cages, some habitat systems units that we're going with. Basically, I'm getting older, and my knees don't like to bend down a whole lot, so I don't like to be on the floor cleaning cages. So I've got females are housed up above, and the males are in some of the rack systems down below. I don't mind bending over, picking up a tub, and putting it on a cart to clean it. So for me, it's working out a little bit better. And again, some of the like our baby racks, and again with all the labels, and then I'm experimenting with some adult rack housing as well, mostly just for space concerns because we've got way too many snakes, but that's a personal obsession problem I have. Okay, breeding introductions. We'll usually start cooling animals around November, around Thanksgiving time. Somewhere in there is where I start to sort of make my list of who I want to pair with who. We'll start dropping nighttime lows. We'll take it down into the low 70s. Usually I'll introduce the male into the female's cage. Most studies I've seen of wild snakes, males have a much larger home range than most females, and most males' home ranges will overlap several females. So I think just from a scent perspective and kind of overall comfort of the female, I tend to introduce the males to the females' enclosure, but I know successful breeders that do it just the opposite, and it works too. Basically find what works for you and stick with it. So take all the information out there, whittle it down, figure out what's good for your situation, and then adjust it accordingly. So sometimes you'll see increased breeding activity when a female's recently shed. Sometimes also we'll mist the enclosure. We've kind of gotten away from misting the animals directly. For one, they don't really seem to like it. They always shake their heads, try to run away. And even if you're misting with a reasonably tepid water, that water is a much greater heat transfer than the air or the animal. And so I've talked with a few other herp keepers over the years, and misting the animals directly seems to lower, or our opinion is that it will lower the core body temperature of the animal more significantly. And so, I've seen actually a decrease in respiratory infections and other problems when we've stopped misting the animals directly. We'll just mist the enclosure, raise the ambient humidity, but not actually get the animals really wet. But it still has the same effect. The animals wake up, they start to move around, they'll find water droplets and drink. They'll find a bowl, if you just put fresh water in there. They like to do that. So, a few breeding shots coming up here. So, they'll do a bunch of different things. You get some of these crazy yellow canaries from the Kofi Islands. Some designer stuff. They'll breed day or night. Doesn't really seem to make a whole lot of difference. Now, this was an interesting situation. Wanted to pair up a couple of green trees and had the pair picked out, put the male in the female's enclosure, and he kind of crawled around the perches for a minute and then started courting himself. I was like, what the heck are you doing? Really? And he kept this up for a little bit, so he kind of kept on working on it. His tail would move around the body, and he was just going to town. I don't know what the heck he was thinking, but wasn't terribly successful. Next morning, go upstairs. Female had been hiding underneath the paper the whole time. He managed to find her over the night, hook up with her, and then went back to the perch. And I came in the next morning, and it's like all I see is this male's tail draped down and going underneath the paper, and I pick it up, and oh, okay, that's what's going on. At least you figured it out. So. Some green trees like to do it in the bathtub. Some like a nice, soft, plush rug. Male combat does occur. I haven't experienced it because I've not been crazy enough to throw two males together for a prolonged period. But they will bite and attack and slash each other pretty badly and can do some very significant damage. Okay, usually we'll continue introductions. We'll put the pairs together for 3 to 5 days. Once they kind of lose interest, then we'll separate them for a few days and then put them back together. We'll usually continue introductions until ovulation has occurred. The females obviously grab it, or the males don't have any interest anymore. Usually once the females have taken, the males will just leave them alone and not worry about messing with them anymore. So. Now, the last several years I've started getting, like I said, back to my technology affliction. I started using an ultrasound machine. Stole that from the ball python guys that were out there, but really wanted to kind of refine and hone some of the questions I had about green trees and what their reproductive cycles were like, And the machine has been great. It took me a while to learn. I'm certainly not a diagnostic imaging professional. So I was self-taught. But it wasn't all that terribly difficult. I was able to look at some, online videos and things and be able to figure it out. It just got a small portable veterinary unit. Actually had a female which I had passed away at one point, so I practiced with the ultrasound. What you wanted to do is find the gallbladder, and so I did it on this deceased green tree. Found the gallbladder, found the follicles, or where I thought the follicles were, used a Sharpie, and then upon necropsy confirmed that, yeah, I really was looking at what I thought I was. But you don't need a fancy machine to know kind of what you're looking at. Females, as they're getting close to having just about right follicles, about 8 to 10 millimeters in size, will have a bit of a swelling kind of up in the body, just behind the stomach. And you have to look at them when they've not had a meal, but you can kind of see on this girl here, like kind of an enlarged swelling area. And again, it helps if your animals are lean and in good condition and not overweight. It's a little easier to see. But at that point, if you see a swelling to that extent without a meal, then it's probably about time to get a male in there with her. And usually they'll go to town pretty quickly at that stage. Okay, what I figured I'd do is basically look at a female, pick one in the collection, look at her 1 year from clutch to clutch. Okay, so basically 1st of July of 2009, this female laid a clutch. She then took five meals, 6 prey items, shed in September, another dozen meals, 14 prey items. December shed again, another 3 meals, 4 more prey items. Next slide. Same female. January, she had 3.5 millimeter follicles, which you can see over here, these tiny little circular things with the numbers and the measurements here. Gives you a follicle size. Takes another 7 meals, 10 prey items. So meals are starting to bump up a little bit. 18th of February, so a little over a month later, those 3.5 millimeter follicles have grown to 5. And then in March, she sheds again. Another meal, another prey item. Next slide. Okay, so early March, she's back up to about 1,000 grams in weight. Still about the 5 millimeter follicle size, so she's just kind of holding right there. Start doing introductions and continue to increase prey. Again, some of these meals are 2 prey items, which is more than what a typical female would necessarily get in the off season. By April, she's gained almost another 200 grams. Her follicles have started to grow to 8.5 millimeters. She's still eating pretty well. And then we're all the way up to May. Now she's at 18.5 millimeters of follicle size, which is a pretty good size. That's coming close to ovulation size. Courtship's starting to decrease. The male's leaving her alone. Nothing's really happening. End of May, she ovulates. 20th of June, she sheds. A little over 1,100 grams in body weight. And on the 5th of July, 1 year and 4 days later, whatever it is, lays another clutch of eggs. So after laying, she was 810 grams, 21 eggs at almost 200 grams of body weight. So that's 20% of her body weight, close to it, was put into eggs. So basically, 369 days between clutches. She had 41 meals and 53 prey items at an average of about 28 grams per mouse. Gives about 1,500 grams worth of mice. She's gone through 4 shed cycles. So that's basically 1 reproductive year of a green tree. And as long as the females are regaining weight and seem to be in good condition, they will continue to produce, in consecutive years. I used to always be a real advocate of giving females a year off after every clutch or every second clutch. And now that I've started using the ultrasound, I'm seeing that as long as the females regain the weight, they're ready to go again. So, one of the more important things is probably just keeping enough calcium in those animals so they can continue to produce eggs, because that is a pretty big drain on the body of the female. And here's an ovulation. basically you can see large mid-body swelling. Normally, you'll see this take place for 24 to 48 hours. Some ovulations are really big and really obvious. Some of the females are really good at hiding, and they don't really show it as much. But usually if you can see that, you're about 40 or 45 days out from egg laying.
Rico?
Yes, sir.
I'm sorry, I missed it on the other slide. But are you breeding just prior to the ovulation? And does breeding stop then once ovulation is taking place?
Yeah, once ovulation has taken place, the breeding cycle at that point is pointless. The male's sperm takes some time to get up in there. So usually what I've been starting to do is start introductions when the female's follicle size is about 5 to 8 millimeters. And then they'll breed heavily up until probably the mid-teens on follicle size. And then the males will start to lose interest.
How much time in between the introductions to the time that she'll usually ovulate? Yeah.
It depends. Various different females can be a little bit different, but you're probably looking at about 6 weeks, 6 to 8 weeks.
So she could be bred in the beginning and 6 weeks later have ovulation, and the ova will pretty
Go on
much
to develop,
be,
yeah.
So you could go up to 6 weeks and still have sperm.
Viable sperm,
viable
certainly,
sperm.
yeah. Yeah, I would say 6 to 8 weeks, possibly longer. Yeah, basically, sort of a brief synopsis here. Breeding, can happen anywhere from 2 weeks. Some people put green trees together, they breed once, female goes off food, she ovulates, and it's done. And basically, that female had been building follicles for a while, or holding follicle size for a while, and just needed that trigger of the male to finish off the whole process. Sometimes you'll start pairing them up and they'll breed, for months on, what seems like months on end, without anything really happening. But there's still stuff going on there. So basically ovulation is day 1. Usually you'll see a pre-laid shed about day 21 to 28 after ovulation, and usually 14 to 21 days prior to egg laying. Most of mine girls are somewhere in the 16 to 18 day range on average. And oviposition or egg laying is usually day 38 to 45 after ovulation. And there's some variation here because of temperatures that you're keeping them at. Higher temperatures will cause things to develop a little bit more quickly. Especially, Maxwell advocates putting the animals back on 24-hour heat, which, I never really do, but that will speed up the process. If you let the animals naturally cycle through a 24-hour thermal period, they'll be closer to that 45-day range. And then the females use nest boxes. In the wild, I think they go either on the ground or in a tree hollow somewhere and find a nice suitable spot to lay eggs. There are lots of different nest box designs out there. These are some plastic ones that I've got that have little hidden black doors I can lift to check on the animals without disturbing them with the acrylic behind it. And I've used all kinds of different substrates in the nest boxes. Let me just roll through the next couple of slides here. Like vermiculite at the bottom of this one, female Copial. Here's one that has no substrate in it. She basically kicked it all out. And I was like, okay, fine, be that way. But that was a pretty classic pose here. The females will basically beehive around them. They'll keep the head right at the very top, and they'll keep those eggs suspended within those coils. And if you let them maternally incubate, they'll sit there and they'll twitch and thermoregulate and basically incubate those eggs for 49 to 50 days until the babies come out. So, next. Sometimes they miss the nest box, they go under the towel, such as life. Usually most females are pretty defensive. If you go in to try to take the eggs, they're pretty good about guarding them. This is actually a nest bucket that I started using over the last couple of years because my old nest boxes didn't fit in my new cage designs. But this actually works out really well. I just use I've gone to like the hardware store, gotten a regular paint bucket with a lid to it, and I turn it upside down, cut a big old hole in the top of the bucket so the female can get in and out easily. And then that way when she lays the clutch, I just take the top of the bucket off. She's sitting on a flat open surface, easy to get at her and pull the eggs and take her off. So, low tech, but it works really well. And newspaper is a substrate or paper towels is a substrate. Any of it works pretty well. And usually I'll go through and I'll number all the eggs. Like I said, remember I'm a record geek. So I'll go through and I'll number all the eggs, and we'll usually pull all the eggs apart, weigh them, measure them, set everything up in an incubation box. Now, of course, when you're breeding snakes, you always run into problems. Retained eggs are, a fairly common problem with green trees and a number of other species. A lot of the time that's a factor of hydration, especially in green trees, because they are from a fairly humid environment. They do drink a lot. When they're passing these eggs, the oviducts need plenty of fluid to be able to keep those eggs in motion and keep them coming out of the body. If the oviduct gets dried out, the eggs will adhere to the oviduct, and then they're stuck and all the eggs behind them can't pass. So then you wind up with dystocia cases and veterinary visits and all kinds of more fun stuff that you'll see coming up here. So they're also prone to prolapse tissue, rectal tissue, oviducts, egg yolk peritonitis, basically where the body is spewing out egg yolk into the body cavity. So this was actually a friend of mine's green tree that had a couple of eggs stuck behind a big cyst that they had to pull some fluid out of. They wound up doing surgery on the animal. She came out of it fine. They can go on to produce more clutches in the future, so don't be completely afraid of surgery. Again, a prolapse shot. Here's another good mistake I made. Being robotic mode, feeding snakes, going around like crazy. I don't know if you can see in the background, the snake's coiled around a food item. This thing's already prolapsed a huge portion of its intestinal tissue with a couple of big fecal matters in there. Not a good thing to do. I don't recommend doing that. It was stupid, but again, I was robotically feeding and not paying attention. So and here's a female with basically adhered eggs in the bottom of her oviduct, where she's prolapsed the tissue along with 2 of the eggs. Next slide. Here you can see basically the vent area here, oviduct tissue there with the 2 eggs in it. Unfortunately, the folicle tissue was twisted. We weren't able to get the eggs out through the natural process. So next slide. We basically had to take her in and have an incision made in the oviduct tissue, and we were able to pull out the eggs. And that tissue is actually pretty good at healing itself. Some veterinarians will stitch it together, others will just let the body heal it on its own. I've known both methods to have worked. So these are a couple of the eggs we got out of there. Obviously, they're not great eggs. They've been in the oviducts too long. So, and here's another case where surgery was done to pull out an adhered egg. You see, I've had lots of problems. This is not all success, trust me. So, this is my veterinarian. Worked with him for many years at the aquarium I worked at. He also has a private practice. So he's been great, been a great resource. I definitely would say find yourself a veterinarian that you can communicate with and you can build a relationship with before you actually need them. Because if you can build that relationship and they can understand your level of knowledge and you can build a trust in them that they're not going to just take your money and your animal's going to die anyway, that goes a long way to really having success in those emergency times when you need them the most.
Hey Rico,
Yes, sir.
can I just say that
No.
one of our board members and also a sponsor, Dr. Kathy Conley, I get hit up all the time, like, hey, who do I take my animals to? So she's nationally known, she's blushing right now, but she's awesome. We've done videos with her, some of the animals. Is David around? David, put your hand up if you're here. Other David. He got a skink and she brought back health. So yeah, right there, you could ask him to show you pictures. She does miracle workers. So I just want to point that out.
Great, excellent. Good thing you got that resource. And again, the lovely fun with mysteriously dead snakes for what seemed like no reason, going through a regular reproductive routine and Thought this really nice high yellow chondro was gravid, going to lay eggs in a few weeks, and found her dead in the cage one day. On necropsy, find out the whole body cavity is just full of fluid. Basically, the yolk gland kept pumping out yolk into the body cavity, and basically all that went septic in the body and killed the animal. Now, for incubation, for those of you that are familiar with pythons, green trees do maternally incubate in the wild, where the females will guard the eggs and incubate them throughout the incubation period. In captivity, a lot of us tend to like to artificially incubate eggs. We always think we're better than Mother Nature, so it's kind of a control factor too with probably a lot of people, myself included. For me, it's nice. I prefer now to do artificial incubation just so that I can keep a closer eye on the clutch of eggs. There's no risk of any bad eggs contaminating other eggs. And I can kind of keep a better eye on things for my own needs, as well as get the female back onto food, because she'll be off of food for a fair bit of time, and get weight back onto her and get nutrition back into her again. But I'll kind of go over the two different types here. So, maternal incubation, basically, Trooper Walsh, one of the founders of the green tree python breeding era, did a lot of work with monitoring females maternally incubating. He actually measured egg surface temperatures, found that the first week the females kept the eggs a little bit cooler, 86, 87 degrees. There was a middle 5 weeks where the eggs were really close to about 90 degrees, where they fluctuated from about 90 during the day down to about 87 at night. And then the last week, the females will loosen their coils and expose the eggs to more air, and bring the temperature down to 84, 85 degrees. The eggs will actually start producing their own heat at about day 28. So the metabolism of those embryos in those eggs will start producing heat. And so if you're artificially incubating, you have to be aware of that and make sure that your incubation containers don't go over, say a 90-degree thermal critical maximum temperature. So average incubation time for maternally incubating females was 49 to 50 days. There's a mama around the clutch. Now, artificial incubation, I've used a number of different incubators over the years, anywhere from little hovabators, little styrofoam hovabators, to fairly fancy incubators that I use now. But basically what you need is a well-insulated box, a good reliable thermostat and heat source, something that's not going to just die on you one day in the middle of incubation. You need to be able to keep a stable temperature. You want good airflow throughout the incubator, so you keep the temperature within the incubators pretty uniform throughout. You don't want to get a bunch of stratification where different shelves and different parts of the incubator are at different temperatures. It's going to be a lot harder to monitor what's going on, especially if you have multiple clutches in there. The box needs to be able to hold humidity. Looking about at 80% relative humidity in the main chamber of the incubator, not necessarily right in the egg box, but you certainly want a really high humidity in there. But you don't want a condensing environment. You don't want a point to where water is the air is so heavily saturated with water that it's going to condense on all the surfaces. Because your eggs are actually a living, breathing organism. They have gas exchange that comes in and out of those egg membranes. And if you have water condensing within that egg box environment, it will basically clog the pores of those eggs, and those eggs will essentially suffocate, is what happens. So, and you want something that's going to be easy to clean, easy to disinfect, because warm, wet environments are great places to grow bacteria. So keeping your incubator clean certainly will help. And like I said, there's a number of different formulas out there. I know there's some YouTube videos where guys have taken these ice chest igloo coolers and converted them into incubators, as well as some commercial incubators that are out there. This is one of the units that I use now. It's made by Habitat Systems, another enclosure manufacturer that I actually do some work for. But I've actually added another shelf in there because I ran out of room. But I can put multiple eggs, egg clutches within that incubator. I've actually got 2 of these now. So not a bad idea to not put all your eggs in one basket. Another lesson you learn. Okay, so with artificial incubation, there are two different methods of doing it. You can kind of go with the Trooper Walsh method, which was one of the original kind of things that they've modeled after maternal incubation, where you fluctuate the temperatures throughout the incubation cycle. Or what I do now is I've pretty much come up with I've kind of averaged it all out, and I've got a sort of a stable temperature that I can run all the eggs at throughout incubation, for the entire time. That way, I don't have to worry about, well, this clutch is at week 1, and this clutch is at week 3, and this clutch is at week 8. Oh my God, where's my temperature supposed to be? I can just put everything in there in one shot, and it works out pretty well. So, but the fluctuating temperature routine, you have to remember, they were measuring actual egg surface temperatures. So, and there's a difference between that, especially throughout incubation. As those eggs start to generate heat, those surface temperatures will change. So if the number set on your incubator is still at one point, and your eggs are gaining heat, you may wind up cooking them and killing the embryos. But they go run the first week at 86 to 87. The middle 5 weeks, they averaged out to about 89. And the last week, they run about 84 to 85. And that really helps the cooling at the end, especially because as those embryos and the eggs grow, they have a much higher metabolism. And so their oxygen demands get greater. If you have the egg sitting in incubation medium like vermiculite or perlite or something, part of that egg surface is covered by incubation medium, so there's not as much opportunity for gas exchange. And as those embryos get bigger and bigger and their oxygen demands get higher and higher, they have a harder time respiring through that eggshell. So cooling at that last week helps in that scenario where you push those temperatures to the high end during the middle 5 weeks. So, and again, like I said, 49 to 50 days on average.
Question, Rico?
Yes, sir.
In an environment like ours here, we average humidity around here during the wintertime can go as low as 20%. So obviously, keeping these things successfully, you're going to have to introduce your own humidity factors. When females lay eggs, and I've seen the possibility of dehydration in the eggs themselves.
Mm-hmm.
What's the best way of rehydrating those eggs? Or under the same circumstances, do you never want to get them wet at any point in time?
Yeah, I really don't advocate for getting an egg wet. I mean, the eggs will lose moisture and absorb moisture through that eggshell. I'm sure there's got to be a critical mass where the egg can't lose more than X amount of moisture. But an egg actually, I'll get to it a little bit later, shouldn't be full and round and turgid, throughout incubation. A natural reptile egg, and chondro egg too, will collapse a little bit, even fairly early on. But if you're going more than about a 15 or so % collapse on the egg, that's when you're starting to impact the viability of the egg long term.
But by bringing up the humidity, then you should be okay.
You should be okay,
contact
yeah.
with them, so that they can continue to breathe.
Correct, yeah.
So in that case, use one of those humidifiers and keep what does that mean? Where there's the humidity in there?
Yeah, I mean, what you're finding in an incubator is basically you've got a heat source that's there that's typically dries the air. Especially if you have fans going in the incubator, it will help to speed the drying process as that air goes across those heating elements. Okay. My incubators all have water sources in them. Actually, my incubators, I just flood the whole bottom of the incubator with water, about a quarter, 3/8 of an inch of water. And my incubators are set up, the ones I designed for habitat, basically take the air in at the top of the incubator, run it through a chamber where the heating element is, and then that air that's been heated comes back across the bottom of that incubator where all the water is, so that that warm, dried air then picks up more moisture again. So if you're running an incubator that's a completely dry box incubator where you don't have any water in the primary chamber, you have to use a sealed egg box. Otherwise, that primary chamber where the heat is taking place is going to do nothing but rob moisture from the egg box and from those eggs. So, but if you keep water within your main chamber, you have a humid environment that then you have another humid environment in. And so that will help retain moisture for those eggs. So I think that may be the route that we want to go out here today. Okay, my little cheating constant temperature routine is more like this. I tend to run a target temperature in the main chamber of the incubator at about 87 to 88. About 87.8 is where I have my thermostat set at right now. And I don't worry about egg surface temperatures because I know that those temperatures are going to fluctuate depending on the metabolic rate of the embryo. What I want to do is I want to avoid the critical thermal maximum that those eggs can withstand and still be viable. So as long as they're not too hot, they should develop just fine on their own. My average incubation time is about 52 to 54 days. So I get a slightly longer incubation time, but I don't mind waiting because I've got, it's far more opportunistic for me. And I think I've seen where I now have larger, more vigorous babies by taking a little bit longer in the incubation process than trying to keep their metabolism high and rush them out of the egg. Well, there's a couple of different debates on how you incubate eggs. The old standby method was vermiculite, get it wet, squeeze it out, stick your eggs on it, everything's good, Nowadays, a lot of folks, especially Python people and whatnot, are going to this no substrate method, where you've essentially got a plastic box with water in the bottom of it, some kind of suspension grid, and the eggs are either in deli cups or actually just sitting on the grid. Go to another slide. Yeah, more variations of the substrate method. You can see some of these eggs are kind of a little bit dimpled in places. That's not a big deal at all. Those eggs don't need to be round and hard the whole incubation time. Next. This is my current setup that I'm doing now. Basically, it's a plastic shoebox. It's got a couple of small holes just for a little bit of gas exchange. And again, like I said, I run a wet box or an egg box within a wet box incubator, so I've got a really humid environment, so I'm not robbing moisture from the egg box. But there's a little bit of water down the bottom of the egg box. The grid is suspended on some PVC pipe, and then the eggs just sit on top of that grid. And they sit like that up until probably day 49 or day 50. And then I'll take them off of that grid and just set them onto like deli cup lids on moist paper towels and let the babies hatch at that point.
There's no lid on this particular bin.
Yeah, there is a lid on this, sorry. But there is a lid normally on this. I took the lid off for the picture.
But you're not getting condensation within that lid?
You will late term, as those eggs and the embryos get larger and they start to respire more, you will get some condensation. You can either take the lid off and wipe it down once a day or every other day, or you can also tilt that egg box just a little bit so the gravity will help draw those water droplets to the end of the box, and they'll fall down the wall or down the end of the box, and you don't have to worry about them dripping on the eggs.
And Rico, when you sorry, I was going to ask this question because I'll get this a lot, but I rotate my eggs. I'm assuming there's same with green trees with most eggs. You don't rotate eggs, keep them always the same way, right?
Right. Yeah, you keep them the same way they're laid up. Usually, if you candle a green tree python egg laying, you'll see there should be a small blood spot in there and just a little bit of vascularization. If you candle them, usually you'll find that embryo, the way the female has it, winds up settling at the equator of the egg or up. Very seldom. You'll never see an egg with the embryo on the bottom. And when you do, those embryos usually don't wind up making it.
So it's okay for the embryo to be on the equator. It doesn't always have to be up.
Right. It doesn't. As long as it's like at the equator or above, seems like the eggs are okay.
So what you're really trying to do is don't turn the egg all the way over.
Right.
If you're pulling them apart or you're pulling them out.
Right. Yeah. Usually when the females lay and if they clump up like that, the embryos will pretty well be set at that point. So that's one of the reasons why I number them and mark the tops of them, so I know which direction to kind of keep them up. And some of my old substrate incubation, I wanted basically just a little bit of condensation in the corners. like I said, I've pretty much given up on that. What I found was basically you wind up with babies that are small and weak, have a harder time getting out of the eggs, and at hatching, those eggs are really full of fluid. Basically, those embryos are sitting in a ton of water, and if they wind up slitting the eggs, if they don't come out and keep their heads out and pop them back in, they wind up, they've already taken a breath of air, their lungs are now functioning, they come in, and they wind up trying to find their way out, they get a breath, they wind up sucking that water into their lungs, and then you wind up with drowned baby green trees, which is not a fun thing. More fun lessons to learn. And there we go back to the data logger stuff again. So basically this is just kind of talking about the data logger that I used, when it started, when it ended, once an hour. The minimum was 61. Okay, next slide. Basically what I did is I took one of these little temperature data loggers and humidity loggers, and I stuck it in an egg box with these guys. Wanted to sort of see what these things went through. So next slide. And basically here's what happened. Started off, incubation was pretty constant throughout. There's a few dips here and there, probably when I was opening the incubator, checking on things. But it's pretty much a flat line throughout incubation. It's kind of a close-up. You can see basically, if this is once an hour, basically I'd probably open an egg box, temperature dropped dramatically for just a short period of time, and then went right back to where it was. And humidity was basically flatlined at about 100%. Okay, like developmental process, like I was saying earlier, basically at the time of laying, you'll see a little bit of vein development going on there. By day 7, you'll see pretty much increased strong veining in the viable eggs. By day 14, really easy to see all the veining. At that point, if you've still got eggs that have no vein development, if they just kind of glow yellow, at that point nothing's going to happen, so you may as well take those out, keep them from affecting the rest of the clutch. Here's just a picture of a candler. Put a bright light, one of these new little LED flashlights work great for these things. And you just put it right up against the egg and you can see the vascularization within the egg. Sometimes, if you get lucky, you get eggs with windows. It's pretty cool. Because you get to watch the embryo sort of develop and go through its little deal here. This one was getting really close to hatching. Although it's not a good sign of a healthy egg, because basically what that means is that egg did not get enough calcium. So that shell wasn't fully calcified. But it made for a cool picture. And dead, bad eggs are going to be discolored and fuzzy and nasty usually, so we get those out. Some eggs leak, which is kind of disturbing, but not necessarily. It's not a dead embryo. It's not a dead egg. It's leaking fluid, but there's still a viable embryo growing inside that egg, which is strange, because that egg is basically that embryo's immune system right now. Until it gets fully developed and comes out of the egg kind of protects it from everything that's the big bad world that's outside, but obviously that's got a pathway for things to get in. And like here's some normally dented eggs, like you were asking about collapsing eggs. These guys are getting closer to term, and so basically the yolk's getting used up, the babies are still in there, but the eggs are denting in. And that's pretty normal. Don't panic if you see that kind of stuff. So go ahead and just keep on going there. Again, more denting of eggs. Okay. Hatching, depending on the temperature, you can see 48 to 57 days. Normally, don't automatically pip eggs because there's some variation that can happen there. I think it's not a good thing to do. Usually I'll wait till the first egg has pipped, and then I'll go ahead and I can pip the rest of them. So, and of course, you get babies of both colors. Sometimes you'll get yolk remaining on some of the babies, especially like I said, when I was doing the substrate method. I don't see that much anymore with no substrate method. Not all bad eggs are bad. This egg had a bunch of fuzz growing on it, but it's still got a viable baby coming out of it. So candling does help. Like I said, manually pip after 8 to 12 hours, so we'll just go and we'll make a little semicircular cut around the top of the egg so the babies can escape. So hit yellows and reds. So it's pretty cool. They come right out of the eggs and they'll start perching. So. Of course, sometimes when you're making lots of babies, you get all kinds of weird freaks of nature. And this was a very messed up clutch, obviously. Hatchlings usually are 8 to 10 grams. 6 grams have been some of our smallest. Actually, I've had 4-gram babies now. Almost 16 grams was the biggest. Like I said, it's sign ID numbers. This will give me the evil eye, so I'm kind of going to speed this up a little bit. Set the babies up very simply in the shoebox system in a rack. They have a perch, they have a water bowl, they have a heat source, and they're given an ID number. Kept about 82 to 84 day and night. Usually the first 6 months to a year is the only time I'll keep them at 24-hour kind of heat. So, some people use the substrate, some don't. Go on, a rack full of baby chondros. I was going to go through some pretty pictures of green snakes, since that's probably why all you guys came. So we're going to go through these fairly quick. The Aru Island morph is actually the type locality for green tree pythons. It has this kind of overall, kind of a really light kind of lime green cast. Sometimes they have a little dark stripe going down the back. They're known for a lot of white flecking. They've got these shorter, kind of stubbier heads, little round, stubby tails. So have some blue on the lateral sides, usually along the lips. Another Aru animal. They vary in the amount of white that they have. Babies are pretty distinctive looking. They're always yellow babies. If somebody tries to sell you a red baby Aru, run away. It's not a true breeding, or the guy doesn't know what he's talking about. Next. Marukis are another one of the southern forms. Very similar to the Arus. Also very similar to the Australian form, the Cape York Peninsula animals. They're known for this kind of singular white scale rose stripe going down the back. Fairly large form. Again, the short stubby heads, kind of a silvery eye, the short rounded tails. Again, Marukis are fairly distinctive. They look very similar to the Arus. The sarongs are one of the mainland locality forms from the island of New Guinea. They typically are a fairly nice kind of green color, have the blue dorsal markings going down the back. Several of the northern population forms have the kind of similar kind of look. They'll have a little bit more elongated head and a more elongated, more pointed tail. Some of the forms on the mainland, like the sarongs, will have a little bit darker tail tips than some of the Jayapuras and some of the other forms. Anaquaria is another form from the sarong, or Bird's Head Peninsula. Most of those are yellow babies typically. They have the yellow kind of eyes. Copia Island animals. It's an island population off the western side of the island of New Guinea. A number of, when they first started coming in, they were claimed to be the all yellow holy grail of yellow chondros. And found out that most of them were being brought in were juveniles or subadults that still hadn't changed yet. They're basically a locale type that takes a very long time before they go through a color change. They can change pretty quickly once they do start changing. They don't quite seem to change completely. It still looks like a yellow snake, but it's like somebody took green food coloring and put it over the top of the snake, so you can see the yellow coming through it. And a lot of the individuals, the adults, will wind up fading back and forth from kind of a really kind of a dirty yellow to a green back to a dirty yellow. There are some adults that do wind up staying yellow throughout adulthood. I've had adult females lay 4 clutches and still be bright screaming yellow. So it can happen. It's just not as common as what all the dealers were saying it was going to be. So, like I said, there's a kind of a dirtier looking Copial. A really unique looking Copial animal that I had for a couple of years. The black-headed canary. Yeah. The juveniles are always yellow babies. Again, kind of the real long, pointed tail tips. Beox are one of the more common forms out there. You'll see them a lot. they have a bad reputation, but it's not necessarily the case. You know, sort of like attributing a personality type to somebody who lives in a various part of the country. Like everybody from the Northeast is a bunch of jerks, or everybody from the South is, you know, really super nice, or, you know, it doesn't always hold true. There are exceptions to every rule. But they tend to have this blocky, sort of a yellowed appearance, kind of big, elongated heads, big, long, pointed tails with usually very dark tail tips.
Hey, Rico, can I just point out that he can attest to it. The one, yeah, right there, that's a Biak. He probed that one today. When I first got that snake, really, really bitey, worked with it half an hour, 40 minutes every single day. You can do anything to that snake. It will love on you.
Fabulous.
It's amazing. So yeah, a lot of it is total.
Yeah, conditioning
It
and,
is.
you know, just familiarization with the animal and you. Again, they're somewhat variable. They do throw both color types, both reds and yellows. The red babies are only found essentially in the wild populations on the northern side of New Guinea. They're not found on the southern portion or in the Australian end. So, and there's some variation in the color of red as well.
So those babies all turn green for the most part, depending on the locality?
Usually, yeah. So, I mean, the Biaks will tend to be a little bit more blotchy yellow. The Jayapuras will probably all wind up turning, you know, green with some blue dorsal striping to them. So, but yeah, they'll go through changes. So Jayapuras, it's another northern population locale type with the blue dorsal markings. Usually don't have as much black on the tail tip, but again, a fairly nice pointed tail tip. Another Jayapura, and they can vary. You know, you'll see Jayapuras like this that have white, and some of these dealers that are out there that are selling animals, they go, "Oh, that's a Nauru. It's got white on it." It's like, no, it's not a Nauru. Coloration is different. Other body characteristics are much different. So you really kind of have to know a little bit about what you're looking at. So Cyclop, it's a mountain range near Jayapura, kind of known for these sort of overall blue wash animals. Again, somebody's basically making a claim over, you know, a generalization over just a few animals that they've seen. Another Cyclop animal. Jayas and Cyclops can have both reds and yellow babies. Usually the dorsal triangles on the mainland animals, the red babies, are much more angular, and the Biak animals will have much more of a rounded sort of a dorsal pattern. So that's one way you can kind of tell the babies apart a little bit. Sometimes you get babies that don't know what color they want to be. So Lara is one of the highland locale types. A little bit darker green, but again, a short stubby kind of head. Wominas, another one of the highland locale types from the central mountain range in New Guinea. These guys are known to kind of go through some slightly more black pigmentation. They'll wind up, most of them will lose it, some of them will keep it. So.
Rico, is there enough temperature change in the higher mountain ranges that they like a cooler temperature?
A lot of people have thought about that, and I think they can probably tolerate a cooler temperature, but I have a feeling that basically those animals are adapted to utilizing certain microclimates to still reach their optimum body temperature. So they may use the habitat a little bit differently, but their thermal needs are still the same as the other locales. More Wominas. Just kind of keep going. Most of the Wominas are dark red babies or black babies. There are some yellows occasionally happening there. Some of the designer stuff that we're playing with, some different high yellows and high blacks. These are all ugly. You guys don't care. But there's yellows. You know, we've been selectively breeding for higher yellow animals. There's a high yellow animal that came from a maroon baby. That's kind of a novel approach. Trying to work toward. Everybody always wants to know, when are you going to get a green tree python that keeps its red baby color? We're working on it, but it's a few generations away. So another high yellow from a maroon. Tricolors, kind of a mixed locale background. Tricolor stuff. The blue forms, there's 3 different forms. Try to go through these really quick. Hormonal blue, basically females that Once they go through a reproductive cycle, they wind up shifting to a blue color. Sometimes they'll keep it, sometimes they won't. Sometimes they'll shift back and forth between reproductive cycles. True blues basically are a selectively bred blue form, basically where the neonates go from baby colors to a green color, overall kind of green body color with probably some blue, and then over time wind up shifting to an overall blue coloration, not necessarily associated with any reproductive event. And then the third one is super blue, basically where the neonates go straight from their baby color straight into being a blue adult. And that's kind of the pinnacle of what everybody's after in chondros right now. It's hard to do. More blue stuff. More blue stuff. Mite phase. Hate the name, but basically black speckled chondros. Black stuff. It's kind of getting more towards mixing the blues and the blacks. Some of the more melanistic designer stuff. We're getting more and more black in some of these animals. Some more designer high black.
Rico, how much do the high blacks go for? Some of my kids.
Well, for you, Justin, I won't charge you any more than 20% more than all the rest of these.
Thank you.
Only because it's a mite face.
I was going to say, when you said that, you're like, I don't like the name. I'm like, I like mites. I think it's a great name.
Yeah, I'm sure you do. Yeah.
Are these adults that we're looking at here?
These are subadults here.
Subadults, so they're still changing.
They're still changing a little bit, but yeah, I mean, most of the time, if you're going to find people producing black babies, you're going to see $3,000, $4,000, $5,000 a piece for big black babies. So, albinos, the only known recessive morph in green tree pythons, first came about in 2002. Damon Salces did it, and then Trooper Walsh did it in 2005 with animals from the same VPI bloodline. I now actually have troopers in my house hoping to get some more albinos, but he's not a great breeder. I need snake Viagra if anybody has it. But kind of bizarre looking yellow animal with underlying really lavender kind of tones where the blues would be. Had a weird white womena at one point, some friend of ours loaned us.
Is that the one that was on breeding loan that passed away?
Yeah. Okay, stuff we've already covered. Yeah, basically captive bred stuff. If you get good quality animals, they're going to be good feeders. They're going to be parasite free, not be nearly as stressed. They're going to be handleable, just like you see them while attacking this guy here. You're going to have a known history on those animals. You're going to know what they've been through their whole life, so you have a much better chance of success with those guys. All right, I think hopefully they're going to kill me for running over. But thanks to Justin and the whole Herp Society. I really appreciate you guys bringing me out. It's a blast. I enjoy it.
Jess has a question. We're going to hold questions really quick because I have a ton of questions. This is what we're going to do because we're running out of time. We're going to do a quick business, then we're going to do raffle, and then right after we're going to have Rico come back up and then do questions just in case people have to run because that next section is usually our conversation side. So please give